February the 12th, 2009. Just outside Buffalo, New York.
Gear down. Folks alive.
Gears down.
Jesus Christ!
The airplane entered an aerodynamic stall. It did not recover. It was one of the grisliest, nastiest scenes that I think I've seen.
The crash of Continental Connection Flight 3407 would be one of the NTSB's most important in decades, and would see a grieving father fight for changes to the laws governing small airlines.
I'm focused and determined to change what exists and not have another dad sitting here.
Mayday, Mayday.
Continental Connection Flight 3407, operated by Colgan Air, is en route from Newark, New Jersey to Buffalo, New York. It's been a busy flight for Captain Marvin Renslow. He's providing guidance to a new first officer, Rebecca Shaw, a former flight instructor from Seattle.
Bless you.
Shaw's only been with the airline for just over a year. She must decide if she now wants to become a captain.
I don't know what I want to do with the upgrade. It depends where I'm based.
Well, think of it this way. If you stayed on the queue, obviously you're not making the captain rate,
Right.
but you may have a better quality of life with regards to buying a house, having a schedule.
Shaw trained to be a first officer on the plane they're flying now. A Canadian-made Bombardier Q400. It's a twin-engine turboprop, popular with regional airlines. The 45 passengers have had a long night. Their plane was held up for 2 hours at Newark, a delay considerably longer than their journey. Flight 3407 is heading northwest over upstate New York. The trip is only 53 minutes. Visibility is poor, and there's a forecast of snow and moderate winds in Buffalo.
Just some water, please.
Elise Kausner is a student at Florida Coastal School of Law in Jacksonville. She's on her way to visit her family in Buffalo.
She had 5 nieces and nephews at the time, and they had a love luncheon at the kids' school, a couple of the nephews, and they both wanted Aunt Ellie to be their guest. Any excuse to come home, she came home. She talked to all of us from Newark.
Hey.
And she called us from the lounge.
Yeah, it's been over 2 hours.
She was PO'd because of the delay.
Folks from the flight deck, your first officer speaking. It looks like at this time we're about 10, maybe 15 minutes outside of Buffalo. Weather in Buffalo is pretty foggy. Snowing a little bit there. I'd like to make sure everyone remains in their seats so the flight attendants can prepare the cabin for arrival. Thank you.
Colgan 3407, descend and
Maintain 2,300.
Okay, down to 2,300. Colgan 3407.
Let's do a descent checklist, please. We can do the approach checklist along with it.
Sure. Bug set.
Set.
GPWS landing flaps selected 15 degrees.
The pilots go through a list of settings for the plane to continue its landing approach.
For off. Yep.
Passengers can already glimpse the lights of Buffalo's suburbs. Clarence Center is on the approach path for aircraft landing at Buffalo's airport.
Gear down. Lokes alive.
Gears down.
All right, flaps 15.
Extending the flaps provides more lift, allowing the plane to slow to its final approach speed.
Jesus Christ!
Suddenly, the control column starts to shake. The Q400 is slipping out of control. Captain Renslow struggles to keep his plane flying. But it seems to have a mind of its own. The plane crashes into a house at 6038 Long Street. At air traffic control in Buffalo, Flight 3407 disappears from radar.
Check Colgan there, see if he's on you.
What's his call sign?
Colgan 3407.
Nope, I don't have him.
You see anything out there?
Nothing.
All right, call the fire department.
I'll never forget the dispatcher's words, plane crash, house on fire. I immediately got my shoes on and my coat on, got in my truck and started heading down the driveway.
Firefighters don't have far to go. 6038 Long Street, home of the Valinsky family, is less than a block from the Clarence Center station.
As I turned towards the village, the whole village was aglow. You could see the smoke, you could see the flame.
Karen Valinsky and her daughter make it out of their house alive, but her husband Douglas is killed.
My initial reaction was there was no way that somebody made it out. But the EMS division reported that they had 2 people and they were taking them to the hospital. And I said, well, which firefighters are they? And they said, they're not firefighters, Chief, they're survivors from the house. I actually physically had to go to the ambulance and look inside for myself to believe.
Firefighters have never seen a blaze like this.
If you've ever gone to a bonfire and stood 5 feet from it and you couldn't take it anymore, that's what it felt like from 100 feet away.
The height of it was just unbelievable, obviously because of the fuel that was probably added to it, and the debris area was very large. It was a very, very horrific sight.
We live in the town where the plane went down, right down the road. My son was driving home from a soccer game and went right by the plane crash and called me up and said, there's a plane down in Clarence. Never really entered our brain that it was Ellie's plane.
Flight 3407 has crashed 8 kilometers short of Buffalo Airport. All 49 passengers and crew are dead, including Captain Marvin Renslow and First Officer Rebecca Shaw. But many more people could easily have been killed.
You picture a house, and to see a plane on top of this house, no more house left, no more plane, only the tail section. You're asking yourself, how in God's creation did this happen? And not wipe the whole block out.
The next call was again from my son and said, in fact, it was Ellie's plane. And he said, Dad, there's no survivors. At which point my wife shrieked and just hit the ground. Chris said he'd never heard his mother make a sound like that, and I hope he never does again. So that's when we knew that she was gone, and that was probably within 45 minutes of the accident.
The scene in the morning is one of utter devastation.
Clint Crookshanks from the NTSB, and I start poking around.
Clint Crookshanks is one of the first investigators on the case.
When we arrived on scene, there was a fire still burning. It turns out it was from a gas line that had been broken in the house. The firemen would put the fire out and it would reignite every couple of minutes. It was one of the grisliest, nastiest scenes that I think I've seen.
Flight 3407 may have been a small plane, but it's the worst crash in the US in more than 7 years. It will become one of the NTSB's most important investigations. The fire at the crash site of Flight 3407 continues to burn, preventing investigators from examining the wreckage.
That's where I think the box.
The airplane had crashed into a house, and then it had burned all night long, so all the debris was basically in the house.
Our concern is that we're losing evidence. It's perishable, and if we can't get in there and get the fire out, then we're not able to maybe get a hold of evidence that might help us during the investigation.
Clint Crookshanks urgently needs to recover the black box flight recorders, which could contain valuable clues about the accident.
We knew that the recorders were in the tail part of the airplane.
Ordinarily, investigators don't go near a crash site that's still burning. But if the black boxes can't be rescued, they may never find out what brought down Flight 3407.
We started looking around and poking around into the wreckage and actually found out where they were.
Okay, whoa, it's probably in here, okay? The access panel's on the other side, so we're gonna have to cut a hole right there, okay?
The fire department produced a chop saw. We were able to cut a hole in the side of the fuselage and go in and grab the recorders and pull them out.
All right, that should do it.
To the immense relief of all, the recorders are undamaged.
Once we took the recorders out of the airplane, we put them on the jet and they were flown back to Washington, D.C. to our headquarters.
Now investigators are faced with a new hurdle. What little is left of the aircraft is hopelessly jumbled together with human remains and debris from the house.
It all burned and settled into the basement, so we had probably 10 feet of debris that we had to dig through in order to recover all of the airplane.
Authorities wonder how they can salvage any useful evidence from this chaos. They get invaluable assistance from an unusual source. A group of students learning to process crime scenes is enlisted to separate human remains from the rest of the debris.
They were graduate students from a local college, forensic anthropology students, and this was good experience for them to come dig through wreckage like this and look for human remains.
It's landing gear over there, please.
It's dirty, painstaking work, but it frees up investigators to concentrate on the aircraft ruins.
So we were on our hands and knees with brooms, with little shovels, scooping out debris, identifying it as to house debris or airplane debris, and then putting it in different piles. The first question for me as a structures engineer is to figure out if the whole airplane made it to the scene of the crash.
The wreckage is carefully studied to determine if the plane's four corners, nose, tail, and both wingtips are present.
If we find all four corners of the airplane, then we know that there was no in-flight breakup. There was nothing that departed the airplane during the flight that may have caused the accident.
One wing has been consumed by fire. The other is shattered into pieces.
Hey, have a look at this.
But investigators are gradually finding what they've been searching for.
Oh yeah, it's the last piece. It's the left one.
It wasn't until several days into the investigation, as we were scraping away some of the debris, that we actually found evidence of the left wing and the nose.
Investigators now have all the pieces they need to conclude that the entire plane is at the crash site. Whatever caused the disaster was not the result of a breakup in flight. The tragedy of Flight 3407 is under intense scrutiny at the NTSB offices in Washington. Officials there try to determine if some kind of malfunction caused the crash.
On this particular accident, we knew it was a landing accident, so we wanted to check the aircraft's performance, and then also we checked for flight control continuity.
Much of this responsibility falls to Scott Warren.
My role in the investigation was to be the systems group chairman for the safety board, so I was in charge of looking at all of the aircraft systems.
Warren analyzes the aircraft's cockpit voice recorder, or CVR, to determine if there were any indications of a problem in the cockpit.
Attendants can prepare the cabin for arrival. Thank you. Is that ice on the windshield?
He discovers that 6 minutes before the crash, the crew of Flight 3407 had noticed a buildup of ice on the aircraft.
Got it on my side.
You don't have yours?
Oh, yeah. Oh, it's lots of ice.
Ice can be a deadly threat to any airplane.
If an aircraft has ice on it, it will have more drag on it, so it'll require more power to maintain a given airspeed.
I've seen on the leading edges in a long time.
Until a year ago, Rebecca Shaw had no experience with ice on an aircraft.
I'd never seen icing conditions. Never de-iced. Never experienced any of that.
When ice accretes on a wing, it adds weight to the airplane, but most importantly, it changes the shape of the wing. And of course, it's the shape, the curved shape of the wing that actually creates the lift. So by changing the lift characteristics of the airplane, it makes it less able to fly.
You know, I'd have freaked out. Like, I'd have seen this much ice and thought,
Oh my gosh, we were gonna crash.
Observing that there was ice on the airplane was an important thing to do. But then it would be important to turn around and verify that your anti-ice and de-ice equipment was on, and there was no indication on the voice recorder that they actually rechecked.
Flaps 15.
The CVR reveals that only minutes after the crew detected ice, a device called the stick shaker went off. It was a warning that the plane was about to stall, literally to fall out of the sky. Shortly afterwards, the aircraft did precisely that.
We know there were icing conditions. The only question was, were they bad enough to induce this airplane to have a failure?
Ice is now the chief suspect in the crash of Flight 3407.
If it's ice, let's prove it.
We were all convinced that we had an icing accident. We said, yeah, it's going to be an icing accident. We just got to make sure we look for these few key aspects of icing, verify that, and we're good.
But some of the victims' family members are less convinced.
Our initial thought was that it was an ice-related incident, that there was an icy night and brought the plane down. And as we began to talk to people who knew airline travel, who were pilots themselves, they would look kind of askance and say, I don't think so. That doesn't make sense.
Some investigators share that suspicion. Scott Warren knows a plane like the Q400 has a sophisticated de-icing system. It's designed to keep ice from building up on the wings and other critical parts of the aircraft. To prevent ice accumulating, the plane has rubber bladders along the front of the wings, called de-icing boots. A series of valves uses air from the engines to inflate the boots and crack the ice off the wing.
Those boots are designed to inflate periodically, and that inflation breaks off the ice that's accumulated on those leading edges.
Warren now wonders if the crew of Flight 3407 actually turned on their de-icing equipment. He studies data from the plane's other black box, its Flight Data Recorder, or FDR. It tracks the workings of crucial aircraft systems, including the de-icing mechanism.
We know from the FDR data that the de-icing system had been selected on by the crew, and it was on during the majority of the flight, and certainly at the end of the flight it was recorded in the on position.
But now Warren needs to figure out if the device was actually working.
Just because the data records that the system is on, that's a start, but you can't necessarily believe that one piece of information.
The only way to know is to find what remains of the plane's de-icing system and determine if it was active when the aircraft went down. Clint Cruikshank's team hunts for a crucial component of the system, the valves.
Excuse me. Okay, everyone, I just want to...
For the de-ice valves, we said, here's what it looks like. Look for something like this. If we can find those valves and we can test them and see if they're operating correctly.
The valves were very important to us because they are the key component that moves air from the engines where the bleed air originates for the de-icing system.
Okay, good. 5 more to go.
Five of the plane's 6 de-icing valves are eventually recovered.
Some were badly burned, some were in fairly good shape. And we took those valves and we conducted as much testing on those valves as we thought was appropriate for the level of damage. We looked at the level of electrical conductivity, and we looked at the pressure testing. We looked at a wide variety of things depending on the condition of the valve itself. And as far as we could tell, all those valves were working properly.
Is that ice on the windshield?
Got it on my side.
Now investigators have to consider the possibility
Oh, yeah. Oh, it's lots of ice.
that there was so much ice on the wings that the de-icing system couldn't get rid of it fast enough.
Oh, yeah. That's the most I've seen on the leading edges in a long time.
It has happened before. In Roselawn, Indiana, a French-built commuter plane crashed in 1994 after suffering a catastrophic buildup of ice on the wing. By analyzing how much power was needed for the plane to maintain its airspeed, investigators reach a surprising conclusion.
Basically, the aircraft was flying as if it had a relatively small amount of ice on it, but a very manageable amount of ice.
Looks normal.
It was not overloaded, it was not excessive.
If ice didn't bring down the plane, something else must have caused it to stall. Warren studies the Q400's operating manual to learn the plane's stall speed, the velocity at which it can no longer generate enough lift to stay in the air. He discovers that in the conditions Flight 3407 was flying through, it's roughly 111 knots. He now compares the plane's stall speed with its actual airspeed just before the stall warning went off. 131 knots, well above the danger zone.
Flaps 15.
When the stick shaker went off,
Jesus Christ!
they were not necessarily at the edge of a stall. They were still 20 knots or so away from the stall.
This new revelation deepens the mystery of Flight 3407. If it wasn't stalling, why did it fall out of the sky? Investigators turned their attention to the critical seconds before Flight 3407 went out of control. They looked for clues that could explain why the stall warning went off when the aircraft was flying well within its safety margins. They discovered that this plane has a unique feature known as a reference speed switch. It governs the sensitivity of the plane's stall warning.
Very few airplanes, in my experience, have such a switch. This airplane is the only one I know of that has an actual switch on the overhead panel. It was designed by the manufacturer to be an extra safety feature.
Some kind of variable ref speed?
Pilots are supposed to turn on the reference speed switch when they're going to be flying through icing conditions.
And we'll probably be picking up some ice.
When in the increase position, it reminds pilots to fly faster to counteract any drag effect ice will have on the aircraft.
When you are in icing conditions and ice does accrue on the wing, it can cause the stall speed to go up And so this ref speed switch correspondingly causes the warning to come on sooner or at a higher speed.
What that switch does is it basically changes the trigger settings for the stick shakers.
So we had to ask the manufacturer, how does this switch work? And what we found was it was part of the system's description that the crews got when they went through training, but they didn't get a lot of training on how to handle that switch. It seemed like it was too simple to worry about.
Investigators need to know if the crew of Flight 3407 had turned on the reference speed switch, triggering the stick shaker at a faster than normal speed. The flight data recorder doesn't show whether the switch was on. Investigators must find another way of determining its position at the time of the accident.
Clint here.
Clint Cruikshanks is given a new priority.
All right, I'll see if we have it.
Recover the ice protection panel from the Q400's cockpit, where the reference speed switch is housed. Since the panel was in the cockpit, finding it is a challenge.
Most of the front end of the airplane was consumed by fire, and so we didn't find anything except for little balls of molten aluminum, little wire bundles, and a lot of ash.
But after an extensive search, Cruikshanks discovers that the ice protection panel is one of the few pieces of the cockpit that survived.
Bingo.
However, the knobs and switches are barely recognizable. Cruikshanks examines the charred panel to check the position of the reference speed switch. It was set to activate stall warnings at higher than normal speeds.
We did find the ref speed switch in the wreckage, and it was in the increased position.
This discovery only raises more questions.
We'll probably be picking up some ice.
The cockpit voice recorder indicates that as Renslow was beginning his descent into Buffalo, he commanded his plane to fly at the normal approach speed. But what's strange is that with his reference speed switch on, he actually should have been flying faster, as this is what the switch would remind him to do. So why wasn't he? The plane's computer warned the crew to fly faster, according to the settings they had configured, by displaying a set of red bars on the airspeed indicator.
You may have a better quality of life with regards to...
These bars are meant to warn the pilots that a stick shaker activation is imminent.
Whenever it's right.
If you're looking at the airspeed indicator, you should be aware that you're getting slow, and the stall warning may come on.
Jesus Christ!
It seems Renslow and Shaw were caught off guard. Still, they could have easily corrected the situation.
Once the stick shaker activated, they could have turned the switch off, or they could have put the nose down and increased their airspeed.
It's clear to investigators that Flight 3407 wasn't in danger of stalling when the stick shaker went off. So now they need to know exactly what happened after the stall warning was activated. An animated simulation of the crash is constructed, based on information from the flight recorders.
Watch what happens just after the stick shaker goes off.
It illustrates that just after the stick shaker was triggered, the plane suddenly pulled up. This action dramatically slowed the aircraft, and at this point it did stall.
Essentially, the airplane entered an aerodynamic stall from which it did not recover. It pitched over and hit the ground.
Investigators are dumbfounded. Flight 3407 wasn't stalling when the stick shaker went off, but a few seconds later it was. The crew's every action during that brief time now demands careful scrutiny.
What did they do?
It's a puzzle. How could a trained flight crew take a plane that wasn't stalling and in the space of a few moments make it fall from the sky?
Anytime you have an apparent stall for no apparent reason, that's a mystery. You would expect that no flight crew would stall an airliner. So the question is why?
The focus of the investigation now switches from the plane to the crew, specifically on the moves they made during the critical seconds after the stall warning sounded.
We wanted to see if the way they flew the airplane was the way they were trained, according to the standard operating procedures that are portrayed in their flight manuals.
The flight data recorder retains information from more than 1,000 different aspects of the Q400's flight operations. From the airspeed and altitude to the position of the rudder pedals and throttles. It also records the movements of the most critical flight control, the control column. Pilots use the control column to change the position of the elevators and ailerons, which manage the direction of the plane. The flight data recorder stores information not just about the control column's position, but how much force is applied to it as well.
The FDR records what the control positions were. It has sensors built into the control column, it has sensors built into the control wheel.
What Scott Warren finds when analyzing the control column's position is stunning. In response to the stick shaker, Captain Renslow should have pushed the column forward to bring the nose down and gain speed. But for some reason, he did the exact opposite.
We found that the crew, instead of pushing forward, which is the normal response to a stick shaker triggering, the crew was actually pulling back on the controls.
This had the effect of pulling the nose up, causing the airspeed to drop and tipping the aircraft into an actual stall. Captain Renslow had apparently mishandled one of the most elemental piloting maneuvers: how to recover from a stall. Above everything, it requires gaining airspeed to get out of the red.
The recovery procedure is fairly simple and straightforward. It requires pushing forward on the controls and adding full power. At any point in time, had the captain pushed forward on those flight controls, he had a reasonably good chance of recovering quickly.
From everything we've gained, that stall was recoverable on a repeated number of levels on a repeated basis. There was no reason for that plane to go down.
Investigators also learned that First Officer Shaw, in trying to help Renslow deal with the crisis, inadvertently made things worse.
I put the flaps up!
She retracted the flaps, reducing the amount of lift as the plane struggled to stay in the air.
Had the first officer simply called out, "You're stalled," advance the power, push the nose over, the airplane would have been able to recover.
From a human point of view, it's sad to recognize that those sorts of things happened and the tragedy that came from that.
It's concluded that Captain Renslow's failure to properly respond to the stall warning was the primary cause of the crash of Flight 3407. As the issue is now pilot error rather than mechanical failure, human performance investigator Evan Byrne is brought on board. His first question: why hadn't either Renslow or Shaw noticed that their airspeed was too low for the icy conditions?
In this case, we can look back towards the fact that there were clear and conspicuous cues of the deteriorating airspeed that were not heeded by the captain.
Byrne listens to the cockpit voice recording to try to understand what might have led to that oversight.
Where you could be home with your husband to take care of and all that stuff.
He learns that the crew had been talking throughout the flight. The conversation continued during the landing approach. It's a violation of a rule known as the sterile cockpit, which bans non-essential conversation during critical phases of the flight.
You're gonna be upgraded in 6 months.
Blah, blah, blah.
Quite simply, it prohibits conversations that aren't related to the operation of the flight.
Let's do a descent checklist, please. We can do the approach checklist along with it.
Yeah, sure.
Bug set.
Byrne also discovers that because of the cockpit banter, the crew performed critical checklists and briefings late.
Off. Hydraulic pressure and
Quantity.
Distracted, the crew probably didn't see the red bar indicating they were flying too slowly for the conditions the plane had been configured for.
on. Approach checklist complete.
Rock and roll.
When crews deviate from standard operating procedures and perform checklists late or don't make the required callouts, they become more vulnerable to subtle mistakes that they may make inadvertently that could lead to startle and surprise or unanticipated events that they have to respond to.
The evidence is unequivocal. The crew of Flight 3407 was badly distracted throughout the approach.
Came in when we interviewed, and he said, "Yeah, you're gonna be upgraded in 6 months."
They had forgotten a key setting they had made that required them to fly faster than normal. They had missed indications that they were flying too slow for icing conditions. Then Captain Renslow had reacted incorrectly to a stall warning, sealing the fate of the plane. Evan Byrne wonders, what could have caused a trained airline flight crew to have made such missteps? He finds a clue on the cockpit voice recording.
Excuse me.
The crew was showing signs of fatigue. Could Renslow and Shaw have been too tired to function effectively on the flight deck? It's a tough question. Answering it will require tracking their movements during the 72 hours leading up to the crash.
It's basic gumshoe detective work in the investigation where we're trying to collect as many facts as we can.
Byrne interviews the families of the pilots.
Could I speak to Mrs. Renslow, please?
He studies the pilots' mobile phone bills and records of text messages. He searches the airline's computer system to determine if and when the crew used it to check their schedules. He needs to track their every move.
And what time did Rebecca leave the house?
We're talking to colleagues or other pilots, check airmen, instructors, and we ask all those people about the pilots, about their recent activities.
He learns that neither pilot actually lived anywhere near Newark, but could not afford to stay in hotels on their salaries. Captain Renslow was earning $60,000 annually at Colgan Air. First Officer Shaw was being paid less than $16,000 a year, substantially less than an average bus driver. As a result, both pilots had made long cross-country commutes to Newark. Captain Renslow from his home in Florida, and Rebecca Shaw from Seattle, Washington. In fact, Shaw had commuted all night from Seattle on a cargo flight that connected through Memphis. Captain Renslow had spent the night in the airline's crew lounge at Newark Airport, after having already worked 2 days. He was seen sleeping on a couch in the lounge. It was against company rules, but pilots who couldn't afford housing near the airport did it anyway. Records show that at 3:10 a.m. on the morning of the crash, Renslow was awake. He checked his work schedule on the airline's computer network.
Next stop, Buffalo.
At 7:29 a.m., Rebecca Shaw sent a text message to her husband, telling him she'd arrived safely in Newark.
Hi, honey, it's me.
Phone records indicate that later in the morning, Captain Renslow was on the phone several times. Rebecca Shaw was noticed having a nap, catching up on the rest she'd lost flying in the night before.
It's not a lot of sleep.
We ultimately concluded that it was likely that both crew members were experiencing some effects of fatigue at the time of the accident.
Her job is to watch the airspeed. Her job was to watch the instrument panel, and my view is she was fatigued to the point where it's like right here, and you're so dull. I think that's where she was, and he just was not capable. He was just, he should have been flying an airplane.
The revelation leads John Kausner to become a fierce advocate for changes to the industry. He raises awareness among both lawmakers and the public about the need to improve regulations governing pilots at regional airlines.
This is just saying we support 3407 families, their fight for aviation safety, and these representatives and congressmen and senators have done that for us, and we're very appreciative.
He takes his fight all the way to Washington, D.C.
We needed to do something, and so we began to advocate in Washington weekly, every other week. I mean, we've made innumerable trips down there. And immediately the families just gelled. We all attended the hearings and began to say, this is what we can do.
The crash of Flight 3407 focused the world's attention on a growing safety problem. The relatives of those who were killed will help eliminate that threat. The crash of Flight 3407 exposed wide-ranging shortcomings in the regulations that govern regional airlines. These smaller airlines now make up half of all daily passenger flights in the US. Their pilots are generally younger, less experienced, earn less, and work long hours.
Their levels of safety are way different from the majors. They have a much lower threshold in training, in ability, so in pay, obviously, so they can't attract a higher qualified pilot.
There are pretty low wages, pretty difficult working conditions, and we don't seem to attract the same level of applicant that we used to. Some regional airlines get into a bind, and they have to hire the first people that meet the minimums.
In the US, of the 7 fatal accidents involving passenger jets over the past 10 years, 5 have involved regional airlines. Those include the crash of Delta Connection Flight 5191 in August 2006, which killed 49 people when the crew took off from the wrong runway. John Kausner's campaign to change laws governing pilots has paid off.
We relied on your support. We needed your support. You nurtured us. We want to thank all of you, from all of us.
A year and a half after the crash, under pressure from Kausner and other victims' family members, the US Senate passed a bill which toughens training requirements and forces the FAA to draw up new rules on pilot fatigue. Studies into the problem of overtired pilots are already underway. At the University of Iowa, researchers are developing a system that could help pilots resist fatigue, stay engaged with the critical task of flying, and prevent future tragedies like that of Flight 3407. Thomas Schnell is a human factors engineer.
We use a number of neurocognitive and physiological sensors that we apply on subjects, pilots that we invite for our studies.
Is going to be free-floating.
We'll just go ahead.
He's studying how pilots stay alert on the flight deck as a test subject conducts a cross-country journey in a simulator. Using sensors, he can determine how alert and engaged a pilot really is. The research could lead to the development of fatigue detectors on airplanes.
We are trying to predict pilot state so that we can adjust something on the flight deck to prevent the problem from getting worse or starting in the first place. We monitor brain activity, eye movement activity, heart, the EKG and respiration and other parameters in an effort to figure out what the pilot's or the crew's state is. Are they fatigued, overworked, are they disengaged or distracted? This section is where they were really drowsy, and you can see that the gaze has become kind of bored.
Schnell instructs the flight simulator to trigger a major systems failure in the cockpit.
It's no good. Everything's dead. Hydraulic systems have failed. Flaps are not deployable.
Crank up that heat map so we can see what this brain activity was.
Brace for impact.
When a crew is fatigued, what you might see is their reaction to events may slow down. So you'll see mistakes being made on the flight deck.
It's precisely these kinds of mistakes on the part of Renslow and Shaw that ultimately crashed Flight 3407 and killed 50 people.
It's a tragedy that should not have happened, that was foreseeable, was preventable, and it's repeatable if we don't do something about it. I'm focused and determined to change what exists and not have another dad sitting here.
After takeoff checklist complete.
US Airways Flight 1549 has just left New York's LaGuardia Airport.
Birds. And that fast, we were just on top of them.
My aircraft
aircraft.
Both of the plane's engines have stopped working.
Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is Cactus 1549.
The plane is falling from the sky. There are only a few seconds to decide what to do.
If we can get it for you, you want to try and land on runway 13.
We're unable.
155 lives depend on the pilots making the right call.
Okay, Cactus 1549, you can land runway 1 at Peterborough.
Can't do it.
With a bad option on the right and a worse one on the left, the crew decides to put their Airbus on the runway that's dead ahead.
We're going to be in the Hudson.
Mayday, Mayday.
New York's LaGuardia Airport, mid-afternoon.
Please take a moment to listen to this important...
US Airways Flight 1549 is a short hop from New York City to Charlotte, North Carolina.
At least it will be a little warmer in Charlotte.
Your seat served.
Together in the cockpit today are Captain Chesley Sullenberger, 57.
Clear to push.
And First Officer Jeffrey Skiles, 49.
We were late because the weather was bad earlier, but by this point, the weather cleared off for our departure, and it was just puffy clouds.
28 brakes released.
Spot 28 for Cactus 1549.
150 passengers are on board the European-made Airbus A320. Businessman Clay Presley is on his way home to Charlotte.
I arrived at the airport at LaGuardia. It was very cold. It had been snowing a little bit that day, and we had a storm coming in, so we wanted to make sure we made that flight and weren't hung up or delayed on some later flights.
The crew flew in an hour earlier from Charlotte, with Sullenberger at the controls.
Your brakes, your aircraft.
First Officer Skiles will be flying the plane back to Charlotte.
My aircraft.
It's a common sharing of piloting duties.
Cactus 1549, runway 4, clear for takeoff.
Cactus 1549, clear for takeoff.
This trip marks the final leg of a 4-day sequence of flights for both men.
We made our standard call-outs. It was just a normal takeoff, normal procedures on the climb out. There was absolutely nothing at all to indicate that this would be any different than any other takeoff in my entire career.
But by the end of the day, they'll be the most famous crew on the planet.
Gear up, please.
Gear up.
Patrick Harton is one of the controllers handling traffic out of LaGuardia today. He has one of the most stressful jobs in the world.
When I sit down in front of a radar, I'm responsible for every person on every airplane under my control. And I take that responsibility very seriously.
Cactus 1549, New York departure, radar contact. Climb and maintain 15,000.
The flight will climb northeast out of LaGuardia and then begin a slow turn south towards Charlotte.
I think I had about 3 or 4 airplanes on my frequency at that time. And it was just a normal departure. You know, it was just another flight that I've handled a million times.
Riding the thrust of 2 General Electric engines, the aircraft powers into the sky.
Cactus 1549, 700, climbing 5,000. What a view of the Hudson today.
Yeah.
After takeoff checklist complete.
Flight 1549 is traveling at almost 400 kilometers an hour. It's been in the air for just a minute and a half.
I caught something out of the corner of my eye, and slightly to our right, but still ahead of us, was a line of birds. And they were very, very close, too close for us to maneuver around. And that fast, we were just on top of them.
You can just feel the power of the plane going forward. And then all of a sudden, there was this gigantic boom. It
It seemed like it stopped in midair, like you hit a brick wall. And then all of a sudden somebody said, the left engine's on fire.
Uh-oh. Before we could even assess the situation,
We got one roll, both of them rolling back.
both engines rolled back to idle.
Ignition start.
Just 13 seconds after their problems began, Sullenberger takes control of the struggling plane.
My aircraft.
Your aircraft.
Get the QRH. Loss of thrust in both engines.
The QRH, or Quick Reference Handbook, is a step-by-step guide to dealing with emergencies.
Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is Cactus 1549. Hit birds. We've lost thrust in both engines. We're turning back towards LaGuardia.
When a pilot says Mayday or declares an emergency, now you go from a focus state to a hyper-focus state. You just focus in on the emergency itself and, figure out the solution to the problem.
Okay, you need to return to LaGuardia. Turn left, heading 220.
220.
All of a sudden there was a smell that came through the cabin.
Something's burning.
If fuel remaining, engine mode selector, ignition.
What I'm thinking, though, at this point is that, we're just going to have to restart an engine.
Thrust levers. Confirm idle.
Idle.
The procedure is to try to restart the engines, and I always had faith we could do that.
Airspeed optimum relay, 300 knots. We don't have that.
We don't.
Okay, Cactus 1549, if we can get it for you, you want to try and land on runway 13.
We're unable.
The conversations with Captain Sullenberger were very short and to the point, which was very appropriate for the emergency. There was a lot going on and wasn't much time to handle it. When Captain Sullenberger simply said unable, it didn't bother me. I mean, he had his hands full flying the airplane, and I understood that. So my job is just to move on to the next option.
All right, Cactus 1549, it's going to be traffic for runway 31.
Unable.
Harton still wants the jet to return to LaGuardia, but Flight 1549 is now just 1,400 feet above the ground.
Cactus 1549, runway 4 is available. If you want to make left, traffic runway 4.
I'm not sure we can make any runway. What's to our right? Anything in New Jersey, Teterboro?
Okay, yeah, off to your right side is Teterboro Airport. You want to try to go to Teterboro?
Teterboro is a small airport on the New Jersey side of the Hudson River, but it's several kilometers away. And without their engines, Flight 1549 is dropping fast.
Want to try to go to Teterboro?
Yes.
When the air traffic controller pointed out Teterboro, I looked at it and I stopped, and I was kind of concerned that he was actually going to try for it. I didn't think we could make it.
So you're sitting there very quietly. People are anxiously waiting for information, and they wanted reassurance that things were going to be okay. You could hear the microphone come on.
This is the captain.
We're hoping he was going to say, I've got this under control, we're going to be okay, we're going to make it, we're going to turn around and go back and land. That's what you were hoping to hear.
Brace for impact.
What does he mean, brace for impact? And then all of a sudden it registered. I think he's saying we're going to crash.
Get your heads down!
I had no idea about how to brace for impact. Everybody's looking around, brace for impact. What do you mean, brace for impact? And how do you brace?
Go ahead. Try number 1.
I put it back on.
Okay, put it back on. Put it back on.
While the crew struggles to fly their stricken plane, Patrick Harton is still trying to find them an airport.
I actually worked Teterboro Airport for about 3 years, so I was very familiar with the airport.
Okay, Cactus 1549, you can land runway 1 at Teterboro.
Can't do it.
Okay, which runway would you like at Teterboro?
We're going to be in the Hudson.
I'm sorry, say again, Cactus?
I could hear him, but my mind really didn't want to comprehend those words.
We're going to be in the Hudson.
That was a death sentence for him, and I didn't want to accept the fact that it was over and there were no more options left.
I don't think we're going back to LaGuardia.
I just emailed my wife and just said, I love you. And I didn't say anything else because I really did not want her to worry.
Okay. Let's go. Put the flaps on.
I thought to myself, great, the Hudson River was our best opportunity. It was really the only thing in sight where we could land this airplane.
Passengers throughout the plane watch the Hudson rise to meet them and begin making preparations of their own.
So I started thinking about, if we're going to crash, I know I need to figure out where the exit roads are. If the water comes in, You need to be able to hold your breath long enough to get to those 4 or 5 rows and get the doors open if you can.
Got flaps out, 250 feet in the air.
We're not going to be able to get an engine started, so I started calling out airspeeds and altitudes.
170 knots.
To give him a situational awareness of what was going on.
Got flaps 2. One more?
No, let's stay at 2. Got any ideas?
Actually, not.
We were so focused on what we were doing, and I always thought it would work out.
Below 300 feet, Patrick Harton's radar can't see the plane. Flight 1549 disappears.
When the aircraft disappeared off my radar, I just assumed that there weren't going to be any survivors.
In the cabin, the passengers prepare for the inevitable.
All the passengers really started kind of pulling together, and somebody yelled out as we were going down.
You ready at the doors?
The folks at the door says, "We're ready." I was just scared to death.
We're going to brace.
Looked like the airplane was going right for the bottom of the Hudson River. All we saw was water cascading over the windshield.
It was like a tornado. Pieces of the plane were being torn apart. Some people were thrown around pretty good.
Then the airplane popped up, and it was just sort of gently rocking in the waves.
We all just sat there. We were all in shock, and we were waiting for what's next.
US Airways Flight 1549 was in the air for just 5 minutes and 8 seconds. Having made a remarkable landing, the passengers and crew now face a new danger. The plane is leaking. The ice-cold water of the Hudson is pouring into the cabin. The crew of Flight 1549 has just performed an extremely difficult aviation feat, but they still have more work to do. Captain Sullenberger heads for the cabin, while First Officer Skiles shuts down the plane.
I stayed behind and did the evacuation checklist, and so it was probably about 45 seconds before I actually went back myself in the cabin after we landed.
In an instant, the $75 million plane has become an unlikely boat floating down the Hudson River. It's now filling with freezing water.
That water was cold. It was very cold, so your feet are freezing. People came to their senses and they said, "Get the doors open, get the doors open."
At air traffic control, Patrick Harton has no idea the plane even made it down safely.
I didn't think anyone could survive a water landing like that. They got me off position because I was obviously in no condition to work traffic anymore.
Harton is led to his union office. Despite his ordeal, protocol demands he recount his version of events.
I really didn't want to speak to anyone. I just wanted to kind of hide under a rock. I needed my wife to know what had happened, but I knew I couldn't talk to her because I was pretty much in a fragile state and I didn't want to break down. So I sent her a simple text message. I said, "Had a crash, I'm not okay, can't talk now."
Passengers nearest the exits open the doors quickly, while Sullenberger and the cabin crew begin managing the evacuation.
I just jumped up very quickly and started making my way to the emergency door. And so I worked my way out onto the wing, just a few steps to start with. I started noticing that people around me had their flotation devices. They'd pulled up their seat bottoms, or they had a life jacket that they'd taken. I had nothing with me.
Skiles heads back to help the crew in the cabin get passengers out of the sinking plane. He knows there's not much time, and one of the flight attendants has been injured.
I went back to about mid-cabin, and Sully and I and two young men were getting seat cushions and life vests, which are underneath the seats, and we're passing them out.
And I'm looking around trying to assess the situation. Is the plane going to blow up? What's the next step? Yeah, there were actually probably 6 or 8 people that went into the water. And they were shivering and they were cold. We started pulling them back up onto the wing.
At the back of the plane, water continues pouring in. Passengers are directed to move forward to escape.
Go over the seats if you have to.
This unwieldy boat won't be floating much longer.
We were actually in the water, you know, up to our knees, and it was just absolutely freezing cold. You know, every part of your body that was in that water just ached to the bone.
Come forward! Is there anybody here?
We were very confident there was nobody left on the airplane, but what was going on the wings, you know, we just had no idea.
Skiles and Sullenberger are the last ones off the plane.
I just saw the big splash when the plane just bounced over the water. A small commercial airline crashed into the water.
They've been in the water more than 10 minutes already.
LaGuardia Airport has sent out an alert to New York's emergency services. In the middle of the Hudson, 155 frozen people hope that help will arrive in time.
I saw the first ferry, and I could see the wheelhouse. I felt like, okay, we're really going to be okay. There was a sigh of relief.
First on the scene are passenger ferries that have been shuttling people across the Hudson. They are eventually joined by the Coast Guard and fire department.
The atmosphere on the ferry was still one of concern because we didn't know whether all the passengers got off the plane at that point in time.
I was sitting in the union office preparing to make my statement.
Where do I start?
And that's when one of my friends popped their head into the office and said, "Hey, Patty, it looks like everyone made it." And I was like, "Really?" That was incredible news. I mean, I was still traumatized by the event itself, but the fact that everyone made it was just, it's like the weight of the world was lifted off my shoulders.
The entire nation looks on as every single passenger and the entire crew of Flight 1549 is brought to safety.
Are you okay?
Like so many others around the world, investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board are riveted to the pictures.
Hey, you gotta see this.
We learned a little bit about the accident, of course, before we launched. The TV channels were showing the aircraft in the river and everything.
All agree that the landing is extraordinary.
I think it was a miracle, and very blessed to walk away. I reached over to Captain Sully and just said, "I just want you to know you saved my life and everyone's lives here."
In my mind, we were dead, and every one of us came out of that alive. It's a miracle.
By evening, the plane is almost completely underwater. The current is pushing it towards the edge of the river.
The aircraft was tied up against the pier, and we went down to look at it to see what we were up against, of course. But we can't do much at night.
NTSB investigator Harold Reichel arrives on the scene.
The water was dark, of course. We just saw the tail and most of the fuselage, and one of the wings was underneath the water.
We knew it was going to be quite difficult to get it, A, out of the water, and then B, to a place where we could examine the components of the airplane in a more controlled manner.
For investigators, it's an unusual situation. Normally, their main task is to uncover the cause of a crash. With Flight 1549, the cause seems obvious.
Birds.
The original Mayday call was clear.
Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is Cactus 1549. Hit birds. We've lost thrust in both engines. We're turning back towards LaGuardia. Okay, you need to come back.
The crew reported that they hit several birds shortly after takeoff.
I think everybody realized that a bird strike had occurred. What people didn't know was what kind of birds brought the aircraft down, whether it might have been a combination of a bird strike plus something else.
whether the crew acted and flew the aircraft as they should have.
My aircraft.
Your aircraft.
Get the QRH.
US Airways pilot made an incredibly skillful emergency landing in the Hudson River.
Investigators want to interview both pilots, but their sudden fame makes them hard to get to.
It became a little bit more difficult than usual to A, locate the flight crew, and then B, to talk to them. They were instant heroes.
Nothing in life can prepare one for the media frenzy of a situation, like this.
And it's not just the pilot's newfound celebrity that's an obstacle for investigators like Catherine Wilson.
One of the most challenging things in this case was nobody wanted to sully Sully. He was a hero in this case, and we were the ones who was potentially going to pick apart what he did and try to find out what he did and whether it was right or not.
To prove that birds caused the crash, authorities need to get the plane out of the water. But a vital piece is missing.
We had been told earlier that both engines were still attached to the aircraft. That turned out not to be true. So that became a major goal right off the bat, was to figure out where that second engine was. We didn't know exactly where it was.
Let's focus on this area.
But we had films of the aircraft actually touching down, and we could cross-reference different things. We used some side-scanning sonar that gave us a very clear picture of the bottom.
It wasn't that easy to do because the Hudson River has a current, and the current changes throughout the day. So it took 3 days, ultimately, to find the engine.
Within days, the recovered engine and the rest of the aircraft are moved to a warehouse in New Jersey, so investigators can study the wreckage more carefully.
We certainly couldn't do it out there at the edge of the Hudson River, and you can imagine how interesting it was to take an airplane 150 or 200 feet long through a very, very populated area in New Jersey.
As the plane is being moved, investigators work with the voice and data recorders.
Okay, let's hear it.
Which were in the most damaged part of the plane, the tail.
The cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder were in virtually pristine shape. The aircraft had sustained quite a bit of damage in the rear end, but the recorders themselves survived very well.
We were really lucky. All of the data was able to be downloaded normally.
We got one roll, both of them rolling back.
Listening to the CVR provides vital insight into how the crew responded to the emergency.
In this case, both Captain Sullenberger and First Officer Skiles acted extremely professionally.
Ignition start.
Each member had their own roles and responsibilities. They stayed with those roles and responsibilities throughout the accident flight and communicated only when necessary.
Put the flaps up.
On Flight 1549,
My aircraft.
it took just seconds for the crew to each assume their individual responsibilities. Part of the reason they handled the emergency so well was that Jeffrey Skiles had only just finished his Airbus training.
This was my first trip out as a regular line pilot in the Airbus A320. I literally was right out of training.
And the benefit of that was that he knew exactly the checklist to turn to, and that's exactly what he did.
Fuel remaining, engine mode selector, ignition.
Crews are highly trained in emergency procedures, and the main thing is to follow procedures in this instance, and that's exactly what First Officer Skiles did by grabbing the quick reference handbook and turning to the appropriate checklist.
But as investigators examine the checklist for restarting this plane's engines, they make a troubling discovery.
It was assembled for an event that occurred 20,000 feet in the air, where a crew would have plenty of time to slowly and carefully go through a 3-page checklist, the end of which was, how do we ditch the airplane?
So it was a 3-page checklist, and really, I only got to about the page and a half through this checklist in the time that we had.
Airspeed optimum relay.
The crew spent a lot of time trying to restart the engines when they could have been focusing on preparing the airplane for the ditching.
300 knots. We don't have that.
We don't.
Overly complicated checklists have played a role in deadly plane crashes in the past. In 1998, a fire broke out on board a Swiss Air passenger jet. The checklist the crew used for that situation would have taken them up to half an hour to complete. It's a half hour they didn't have. But on Flight 1549, the checklist was far from the greatest challenge facing Sullenberger and Skiles.
I'm not sure we can make any runway.
Water landings are notoriously difficult because unless they're perfect, they can be catastrophic. In 1996, after a hijacking, an Ethiopian Airlines captain tried to land off the Comoros Islands when his plane ran out of fuel. His left wing hit the water first, causing the plane to cartwheel. It was ripped to pieces. Of the 175 people on board, only 50 survived. Investigators soon learn that none of the major airlines use simulators to teach pilots how to land on water.
Training for ditching in a simulator is very difficult. We don't have the models to accurately simulate what an airplane would do when it touches down on water. Given the rarity of this type of event, it would be very difficult to justify training pilots for this type of event.
But even without ever going through a simulation, Captain Sullenberger got almost everything right. He kept the nose up and wings level. He let the tail hit the water first, slowing the jet down enough so that it survived the impact.
Nice flying.
NTSB investigators turned to their own simulation to answer a vital question.
This is the captain.
Did Sullenberger have to land in the Hudson?
Brace for impact.
Or could he have made it to a runway?
Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Cactus 1549. Hit birds.
Investigators studied Chesley Sullenberger and Jeffrey Skiles' actions in the moments after their plane collided with birds.
Ignition.
We wanted to know, did the pilots do the right thing? So what we did in the simulator was we tested exactly that. Was there enough energy to make it back to LaGuardia? And what we found was that about 50% of the time we were able to make it back to the airport.
But when a 35-second delay is imposed after the bird strike to account for the crew's attempt to restart the engines, all of the simulator pilots crash before reaching the runway.
When we took into consideration the decision-making process that Captain Sullenberger went through, we realized that it was not possible to make it back to the airport.
Cactus 1549, runway 4 is available.
There's no doubt.
We're going to be in the Hudson.
Putting the plane in the Hudson was the right call. Sullenberger didn't have enough altitude to glide to either LaGuardia or Teterboro airports.
Got one roll. Both of them rolling back.
The investigators also discover that Sullenberger made a decision that wasn't at the top of the checklist, one that was critical to the survival of everyone on board.
I'm starting the APU.
On commercial jetliners, the engines provide power to electrical systems. If the engines stop working, the crew eventually loses those systems. The APU is an emergency generator that keeps some things running.
The APU allowed him to still see his screens, the instruments still worked.
It also allowed the A320 itself to assist with the heroic landing. The APU provided power to the plane's electronic brain, stopping the pilots from making any potentially dangerous moves. It kept them inside a so-called flight envelope.
By starting the APU early in the sequence, the flight crew was able to maintain the flight envelope protections, which prevented the airplane from stalling when the airspeed got too slow.
He's right on the edge of stall speed.
The flight data shows that Sullenberger was going slower than the ideal speed.
The airspeed during the accident sequence got about 20 knots slower than it should have been for this flight.
But the A320's flight computer is designed to constantly adjust the plane's pitch and keep it from stalling.
We definitely could have had a much more catastrophic outcome had the airplane actually stalled.
Starting the APU.
Sullenberger's quick thinking made sure the plane's complex computer system kept working. It gave him an automated safety net, so he'd have the best chance to do the nearly impossible.
We're going to be in the Hudson.
It was a combination of a good crew and a good airplane.
Let's go. Put the flaps out.
The captain had the presence of mind, for instance, just before they were about to land, a couple of 100 feet in the air, to turn to the first officer and ask,
Got any ideas?
Actually, not.
They were both coordinating right up to the end, and that's what we like to see.
Skill, training, and the aircraft's very design combined to save the lives of 155 people. But investigators still want to know how birds crippled two highly advanced jet engines, and if they can stop it from happening again. 8 days after the crash, investigators are finally able to examine the engines in detail. Richard Dolbear has spent much of his career studying collisions between birds and airplanes.
When aircraft strikes a bird, generally there's not much left of the bird, particularly if that bird goes through the engine.
The engines are analyzed piece by piece to try and figure out exactly what happened 3,000 feet above New York.
Let's look inside.
We expose the engine surfaces to a black light. Proteins from many tissues will fluoresce with a black light. Much of the tissue was already gone, but many of the proteins stayed on the surfaces of the engine.
Look at that.
Deep in the right engine, investigators find about a cup of charred remains.
Most of the remains found were just muscle tissue, bone fragments, and minuscule feather remains. I was able to find about 29 samples in one engine and 14 in the other.
But the engines aren't the only part of the plane that's been damaged.
Birds.
Whoa! The aircraft hit many birds. So we found evidence on the wings and on the flaps and on the fuselage, but the plane can still fly when that occurs.
The threat posed by bird strikes is well known.
Bird strikes are a much bigger problem than the general public realizes. In the last 20 years, there have been approximately 210 aircraft that have been destroyed because of collisions with birds.
This Boeing 757 ingested a crow while taking off from Manchester, England, later landing safely. In 2008 alone, there were 4 dramatic accidents. A Boeing 747 sucked a kestrel into one of its engines. The crew aborted takeoff and survived. The plane was ruined. This jet ingested pelicans into both engines, and one ended up in the cockpit. Repairs cost $2 million. The engine of an MD-10 was severely damaged by a gadwall. The repair cost was $900,000. And 5 people were killed when this Cessna smashed into at least one pelican. More than 200 people have died in bird strike accidents since 1988. The problem could get worse because there are more birds out there.
By restricting the use of pesticides that were hazardous to birds, such as DDT, we've seen a tremendous rebound in the populations of bird species. A remarkable increase in the Canada geese that are resident, non-migratory birds. Nationwide, the population has grown from about 1 million to about 4 million.
At LaGuardia, one of the airport's biggest problems is a year-round goose colony on nearby Rikers Island.
From the year 2002 to 2004, there were 8 Canada goose strikes at LaGuardia Airport. It involved birds either on the airport or right off of the airport. One of those strikes almost caused a plane to crash, and it was a very close call.
For the past several years, airport officials have rounded up hundreds of geese from Rikers Island and euthanized them. It's controversial, but should be effective.
So, where did these birds come from?
If the geese that hit US Airways Flight 1549 were local, they can be controlled. Investigators need to know more about them.
The remains that we did find were so small that we couldn't really tell what type of birds. We enlisted the help of the Smithsonian Institution. They can take remains, even very small remains, small pieces of feathers or flesh or whatever, and they can identify them.
The hope is that DNA analysis of the remains will not only confirm the bird's species, but also offer clues as to where they came from. While they wait for answers, investigators turn to answering the question of how a few birds forced a 68-ton jet from the sky. Before they can be used in a passenger jet, engines undergo rigorous testing to prove they can perform under extreme conditions. The tests include ingesting frozen bird carcasses. The CFM turbofan engines that power the A320 passed those tests and were certified in 1996.
The large bird test required for the CFM engine is shooting a 4-pound bird from an air cannon into the engine, which is running at near full power.
To pass, the engines don't have to keep running. They only have to stay together, which they did on Sullenberger's plane.
Well, the engines did not experience what we call uncontained failures. No large chunks of fan blades or anything flew out through the cowls to hurt people inside the airplane.
Fan blades are always the most interesting part to look at, and they often tell quite a story.
A series of fan blades throughout the engine compress incoming air until it's ignited in the core, creating thrust. Ingested birds can wreak havoc on this process.
When a fan blade of an engine fails, it causes a lot of continuing damage. In this particular case, all the fan blades were there. They suffered severe damage, but none were broken.
An analysis of the engines shows that while the primary fan blades survived the impact, the delicate machinery inside the cores of both engines did not.
Uh-oh. We got one roll, both of them rolling back.
Once we went into the engine itself, into the core, we determined that there was significant damage. When a bird gets ingested into the core, it is such a large mass compared to these blades that it does a lot of damage to them.
The birds ingested into Flight 1549.
Mayday, 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 this is Cactus 1549.
Ripped apart the engine's compressors. Metal shards from these broken compressors were sucked deep into the cores of both engines, shutting them down.
We've hit birds, we've lost thrust in both engines.
When DNA results come back from the Smithsonian Institution, investigators finally understand why Flight 1549 lost both its engines. The birds that struck Sullenberger and Skiles aircraft were adult Canada geese. They were far larger than anything the engines were ever tested for.
Because of that analysis, we know that these birds ingested each probably weighed about 10 pounds.
The tests also confirmed that as many as 4 large birds had hit Flight 1549's engines. It was simply too much for them to handle.
Rarely do birds get ingested into the core of the engine. Rarely does an engine ingest the bird and then stop running completely. That's a very rare event.
Ignition start.
What makes this one even rarer is that both engines ingested birds and both shut down.
We're going to be in the Hudson.
The DNA test also proves that the geese involved in this accident were not the local geese that LaGuardia has worked so hard to manage.
These were geese that had been in northern Canada during the preceding summer. They were migratory geese.
The collision between the migrating geese and Flight 1549 happened 7 kilometers from the airport. It means that none of the existing programs for reducing the number of birds would have prevented the collision. It also means that what happened to that flight could happen again, unless a way can be found to keep birds and planes apart.
Romeo Whiskey 2-1, radar contact, launch report 20 DME southeast Melbourne.
Every year, about 2 million planes pass over New York's airspace.
Most people do not appreciate the problems that birds can cause to aircraft. They don't realize how a small, seemingly insignificant organism in relation to the size of an aircraft can cause these kinds of catastrophic failures.
The airline industry needs to find solutions to bird strikes. Placing screens in front of the engines is one of the most obvious answers, but there are serious drawbacks.
Screens can fall off, screens can break, and then they would be ingested into the engine, causing similar damage or more catastrophic damage.
Screens can also introduce turbulence to the airflow, which can starve the engines of air, causing them to fail. Winter weather is also a serious problem for engine screens.
A screen is a perfect ice builder, and it will accrete ice very quickly in icing conditions.
A more promising solution is already being tested in several American cities, including New York. At John F. Kennedy Airport, specialized radar is sweeping the skies looking for birds near planes. Most airports are equipped with radar that sends out radio waves that simply bounce off objects in the sky. Typically, only large objects are seen, and most of this information isn't passed along to air traffic controllers.
The fact is that their scopes would be cluttered with things. Tall masts from ships, for instance, would pop up on their radar as low targets. The clutter, in fact, would interfere with air traffic control, and that's not a good thing.
But now, finely calibrated avian radar is being tested at JFK. It can distinguish items the size of hummingbirds. If any birds are detected moving through flight paths, crews could be alerted.
I would love to see bird radar technology. The key would be how to incorporate that without increasing workload to an already stressed controller.
Tests continue, but widespread use of avian radar is still years away.
Cactus 1549, runway 4, clear for takeoff.
Cactus 1549, clear for takeoff.
Until then, collisions between birds and planes will continue. What the safe outcome of Flight 1549 proved is that right now, the best defense against this threat is a good team in the cockpit.
We had a very experienced flight crew with very good training.
My aircraft.
Your aircraft.
Get the QRH.
All your training that you've done, all the years that you've been flying the airplanes, it all just comes back to you when you need it.
My aircraft.
Sully and I worked together extremely well on this event. I knew what was in his mind, and he knew what was in my mind. We were both accomplishing our individual roles, but we had a knowledge of the whole situation.
Okay, you need to return to LaGuardia. Turn left, heading 220.
220.
This event definitely puts things in perspective for you as a controller. One thing I appreciate more, the teamwork and how when you work together, you can pretty much accomplish whatever you need to accomplish.
Off to your right side is Teterboro Airport. You want to try and make Teterboro?
We're going to be in the Hudson.
The landing in the Hudson took training and skill. It also took a bit of luck.
We had a very clear day. We had a perfect condition for the river. So there was just a series of really fortunate events that occurred that assisted this crew in landing successfully on the river.
Well, at the safety board, we don't really deal in miracles very often, but this event had a lot of things that came together at the right time and the right place. And so a lot of us are thinking, well, maybe we do have a miracle here.
What a view of the Hudson today.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent towards Amsterdam Schiphol Airport.
To turn that off for now, sir. Thank you.
Turkish Airlines Flight 1951 is preparing to land in Amsterdam.
Amsterdam, Turkish 1951, descending to 7,000, speed 250.
The crew is flying a state-of-the-art Boeing 737.
Flaps 15,
Localizer alive. Localizer capture.
In the final moments of the flight, the landing turns into a catastrophe. The plane falls like a rock. The crash of Turkish Airlines Flight 1951 involves the most popular plane on Earth. With nearly 1.5 million passengers boarding 737s every day, investigators need to figure out if the problem was with the plane or with the pilots flying it.
Mayday, Mayday.
On the morning of February the 25th, 2009, Turkish Airlines Flight 1951 becomes the first plane to crash at Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport in more than 10 years.
It smashed into the ground really hard. It made a tremendous noise.
The plane hits the ground in a muddy field just north of runway 18 right. Since the crash was so close to the airport, rescue workers arrive quickly. Most of the passengers have survived, but many are badly injured. Survivors are taken straight to local hospitals. Images of the Amsterdam accident quickly spread around the world. This is the third crash of a passenger jet in the past 6 weeks. The sudden nature of this accident adds to the mystery. It doesn't take long for the Dutch safety board to arrive at the scene. They will be investigating this accident, but they won't be alone. The crash involved an American-made plane, so the US National Transportation Safety Board sends Joe Sador, one of its most experienced investigators, to Amsterdam.
When it's a non-US registered aircraft that crashes overseas, such as this Turkish Airlines, we are the state of manufacture and design of the airframe, and also in this case the engines.
Fuselage in 3 large pieces, engines forward of the main wreck site.
Flight 1951 was one of the most advanced aircraft in the skies, the Boeing 737-800 series. It's designed to travel longer routes at higher altitudes.
The new generation 737 is still the best airplane Boeing ever built. We developed an airplane that had an improved wing, improved avionics, simpler systems that required less maintenance.
Investigators know this isn't just any plane. The 737 is the world's best-selling commercial jet. Finding out why this one crashed is imperative. There are more than 5,000 of them in the skies. They carry about 1.5 million passengers a day. Investigators must quickly determine if there's a flaw with the plane that could cause another accident. What they know so far is that Flight 1951 had been traveling from Istanbul, Turkey, to Amsterdam. There were 128 passengers on board the early morning flight, including 4 engineers from Boeing.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent towards Amsterdam Schiphol Airport. Please raise your seat backs to the upright position and stow away your tray tables.
There was no mention on board of any kind of trouble in the cockpit. The crash has killed 9 people, including 3 members of the Boeing team and the pilots in the cockpit.
See if you can get me some aerials of the crash site.
There are eerie similarities to another recent accident involving a Boeing aircraft, British Airways Flight 38.
Approximately a year before this, there had been a 777 short landing at Heathrow, which had a dual-engine flameout.
In that accident, a Boeing 777 fell to the ground short of the runway. The British Airways pilots reported that both their engines stopped delivering power just before landing. At the time of the Turkish Airways crash, the cause of that accident hasn't been found. Like in that case, investigators have plenty of clues to work with. The plane and its engines are largely intact. The flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder are found in good condition. There are also plenty of survivors to describe what happened. According to the passengers, the landing had been routine, but then suddenly the plane simply dropped out of the sky and hit the ground. But perhaps the biggest clue comes from the crash site itself. The wreckage is not spread out. It tells investigators that the plane could not have been traveling forward at high speed when it hit the ground.
The way the aircraft had crashed, it did appear to be some sort of a landing accident in which there was moderate control of some sort.
The pattern of debris and the passenger reports point investigators to an immediate suspect: the engines.
The engines issue was a very big issue in my thought process at the time, initially.
There's no evidence of fire on the fuselage. In many crashes, fuel in the plane's tanks ignites on impact. The lack of fire raises an obvious question. Did the engines stop running because Flight 1951 had simply run out of gas?
That was one of the first thoughts that I had was, did this airplane have fuel aboard? Because otherwise, how does a 737 literally fall out of the sky on approach to an airport?
But the location and condition of the plane's engines suggest that perhaps they didn't quit in flight.
Sure looks like it was running.
When we first looked at where the engines ended up, the initial impression was that they probably were producing thrust at impact, given that they were so far forward of the main wreckage. That was just a very general conclusion.
Only the flight data recorder can tell investigators how much power the engines were generating in the seconds before the crash.
Lots of fuel. Rules that out.
It doesn't take long to discover that there was plenty of fuel in the plane's tanks. Flight 1951 definitely did not run out of gas. Passengers report that in the final seconds before the crash, the plane hit what felt like turbulence. It points investigators to a well-known culprit, a microburst. A microburst is a powerful column of air that shoots out of storm clouds. It can literally slam a low-flying plane to the ground.
If an airplane flies into that at approach speeds, you're not going to be flying anymore. You're going to come out of the sky. Certainly, it was one of the things that all of us took a look at the beginning. Was there a microburst?
In 1985, a Delta Airlines flight was caught in a microburst while landing at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. The plane hit the ground short of the runway. 137 people were killed. Investigators learned that there were heavy clouds above the airport at the time of the accident. A powerful gust of wind may well have accompanied them. The flight data recorder will have recorded wind speeds outside the plane. Investigators will need to analyze the flight data to prove the microburst theory. In the meantime, the rescue has led to an unusual discovery.
There was 3 pilots in the cockpit, which is unusual. This is a 2-crew cockpit. So why was that 3rd pilot there?
Since none of the 3 pilots survived the accident, it's all the more urgent for investigators to retrieve the data from the cockpit voice recorder. It records conversations in the cockpit. They're in luck.
Because of the way that the aircraft crashed, access to the recorders and the condition of the recorders was excellent.
The reason for the 3rd pilot is soon uncovered.
Flying standard arrival route, visibility 3,500 meters, expected to decrease to 2,500 meters.
For First Officer Murat Sezer, this had been a training flight of sorts. He was new to the airline and was being shown the intricacies of landing at Amsterdam's airport.
In the Jepson charts, which is what all pilots use to navigate to and from Schiphol, there's 102 pages of information on Schiphol alone. So there's dozens of approaches.
Runway 18 right has 3 high-speed exits to the left.
The captain, Hassan Arisan, was doing double duty. He was training his first officer.
Make small corrections as we get close to the runway.
And was in command of Flight 1951. It's because Captain Arisan was teaching that there was the 3rd pilot in the cockpit. Olgay Ojgur was a safety pilot. He was there to keep an eye on the flight's progress during this training mission.
The purpose of that second set of eyes is to make sure that the captain and the first officer, if they are in a situation where it's a little bit of a training portion of the flight, that they don't miss something.
We got a clean recording?
The voice recorder reveals that the 3 crew members began preparations for landing when still above 8,500 feet.
Amsterdam, Turkish 1951, descending to 7,000, speed 250.
But the voice recorder has picked up an unusual sound, a warning that makes no sense at this stage of the flight.
One of the investigators from Boeing was a engineering pilot that came and helped with the CVR. And he's listening to see when, or are there any unusual sounds that can be heard that would not be normal.
Speed okay for ILS 18 right. Descent to 4,000, ILS 18 right.
The alarm keeps sounding. It's the landing gear configuration warning horn. Captain Arasan continually dismisses it.
Turkish 1951, descent 4,000, ILS 18 right. Landing gear.
Is that the landing gear warning? They're at 8,300 feet here.
The warning is a solid clue, but investigators can't yet see how it could possibly have caused a crash. The crew of Turkish Airlines Flight 1951 got warnings to extend their landing gear while still thousands of feet in the air.
On the initial listen, we heard a gear warning horn occur as the aircraft was approaching, when it was still up and it was coming in about 10,000 feet and below.
Investigators now turn to the flight data recorder to help solve some of the mystery surrounding this flight. The analysis of wind speeds outside the aircraft is completed. It's clear none are drastic enough to have brought down the plane.
Some evidence of a microburst.
But the flight data recorder does provide some valuable insight into the cause of the landing gear warning. One of the instruments that measures altitude had the plane already on the ground.
When we looked and saw the radio altimeter data, on the recorder it showed about 8,000 feet, and then immediately it went down to about -8. -8 feet is an indication that the aircraft's on the ground, but of course it's still at 2,000 feet.
The Boeing 737 is equipped with 2 separate altimeters. One measures air pressure to determine the plane's height above sea level. That reading is displayed prominently in the cockpit on both pilots' flight display.
10, set, sir.
The plane is also equipped with a radio altimeter. It's made up of 4 antennas. 2 transmit signals to the ground, and 2 others read the signal that bounces back to determine the plane's height.
It's precise. It's very, very precise. Pressure altimeters can sometimes be not as accurate, and radar altimeters are 100% accurate if they're working properly.
One antenna feeds the reading to the first officer's display. The other feeds the captain's instruments. In the case of Flight 1951, the captain's side was wrong most of the flight. Investigators go back over the CVR and make a puzzling discovery.
Amsterdam, Turkish 1951, descending to 7,000, speed 250. Radio altimeter.
Captain Arasan seems to have known that the landing gear warning was being caused by a faulty radio altimeter.
The airplane thought that it was low to the ground and the gear was not down. And the captain recognized that the problem was really in the radio altimeter, showing him that they should be on the ground, and he goes, it's just the radio altimeter.
Throughout much of the approach, the captain's radio altimeter had been displaying a reading of -8 feet, triggering the warning to lower the gear.
They treated it like it was a nuisance.
Turkish 1951.
Descend to 2,000.
2,000, 1951.
Investigators dig for any other abnormalities. They learn that with Flight 1951 still about 17 kilometers from the airport, controllers directed the pilots to begin their final turn to line up with the runway.
Turkish 1951, left heading
210, cleared approach.
18 right.
Left 210, clear ILS, Turkish 1951.
210 set, sir.
This turn puts Flight 1951 in line with runway 18 right. It's equipped with an instrument landing system, which sends out a signal outlining the ideal descent path to the foot of the runway. The autopilot follows that glide path until the plane is a few hundred feet from the ground. Then the pilot takes over. It makes landing almost effortless.
The ILS is pretty easy to follow. It's a video game. My daughter has flown in a simulator and can land a 737 using the ILS.
The crew begins configuring their plane for landing, unfazed by the warning horn that's repeatedly triggered by the malfunctioning radio altimeter.
Flaps 15.
10 kilometers out, Flight 1951 picks up the ILS signal that will guide the plane to the runway.
Localizer alive. Localizer capture.
The safety pilot, Olgay Ojgur, now reminds Captain Arasan about the failed altimeter.
We have radio altimeter failure, sir.
Okay.
Turkish 1951.
Runway 18 right. Clear to land.
Clear to land, thank you.
Investigators are stumped. The crew knew about the malfunction and continued their approach. How had it then caused them to crash? Clearly, there was more to this accident than a faulty altimeter.
The whole premise of airline safety, the way we build the airplanes, the way we fly them, is based on the idea that we can have any number of failures and we should still be able to arrive safely. The radio altimeter is just one instrument. There's no way in the world that that one instrument, if it fails, should be a major cause of worry that we're going to have a crash.
Investigators wonder if the crew had been given proper guidance for their approach. They turn to exchanges between the pilots and the controller who guided them in. They carefully review every instruction.
Turkish 1951, descend to 4,000. Speed okay for ILS 18 right. Turkish 1951, descend to 2,000. Turkish 1951, left heading 210, cleared approach 18 right.
By following the controller's instructions, the crew made their final turn much too close to the runway.
So to intercept properly, they should be here.
International guidelines call for approaching planes to intercept the signal that guides them to the runway from below. It's so pilots don't have to make any drastic last-minute course corrections to get to it.
To intercept here, they had to descend.
But Flight 1951 was given instructions that brought it to the threshold of the glide slope while still way above it. It's a common practice at Schiphol because it gets planes to the runway faster.
Because they were so close, they had to capture the glide slope from above. Although it is an unusual situation, it is one that can be handled by a flight crew if it is managed properly.
Approaching a glide slope from above is more difficult, mostly because the crew has to suddenly slow the plane and descend rapidly to intercept the signal.
We also call this a slam dunk approach, and some pilots like it, some pilots don't. It's a little bit harder, and things happen quicker when you're above the glide path trying to intercept from above, and it's just a challenge for a lot of pilots.
The approach from above increased the crew's workload, but it's standard practice at Schiphol Airport.
I've flown into Schiphol dozens of times, and I expect it.
If the controller's instructions had somehow overtaxed this crew, their conversations would indicate it. They're just 5 kilometers from the runway.
1,000.
Check.
Flaps 40. Speed brake.
Speed brake armed. Green light.
One thing at a time. Landing gear.
Gear down, 3 green.
Flaps?
Flaps 40, green light.
500.
All lights on.
Please warn the cabin crew.
Cabin crew, take your seats.
Then, real trouble. A stall warning.
Speed, sir.
I have control.
100 knots of speed.
Arisan fought to save his plane, but just 400 feet above the ground and only 1.5 kilometers from the runway, the Boeing 737 suddenly fell straight down. It only took a few seconds for it to hit the ground.
Turkish 1951.
The recording sheds light on the final minutes of the flight. The crew was configuring their plane for landing well after it should have been done.
Flaps?
Flaps 40, green light.
Most airlines have regulations that call for a flight to be stabilized, to have all checklists completed by the time the plane hits 1,000 feet.
In instrument conditions, you're required at 1,000 feet to have basically everything done. The airplane is configured, you have slowed, you have run your before landing check, and you have received your landing clearance. And from 1,000 feet on in, you just monitor the instruments, and we're looking for the runway.
Please warn the cabin crew.
Cabin crew.
In fact, this crew was still running their checklist up to the moment the crisis hit, 460 feet above the ground.
This approach was not stabilized.
Because the aircraft was unstable, the flight crew was in a very high workload environment in the last 1,000 feet of flight.
The radio altimeter was malfunctioning. The aircraft was giving off warnings. The crew was assigned a challenging approach, and they were executing a checklist late. But none of this explains why Flight 1951 crashed.
In these type of accidents, you can never get inside the head of the pilots. And that's a very frustrating type of accident.
But the flight data recorder does provide another intriguing clue. Moments before Flight 1951 hit the ground, the plane's engines were at idle, hardly providing any power. Perhaps this accident is a repeat of the Heathrow incident.
The engines, it was interesting to note, were at idle approximately the last 2 minutes of the flight, until the very end when the thrust was increased again. That was a big red flag right there. The question is why was that the case?
But then they spot something that's very different from the accident at Heathrow.
Tart flare mode.
For some reason, while still more than 1,000 feet above the ground, the plane's computer began preparing to touch down. In retard flare mode, engine power is reduced to idle by the flight computer, and the plane's nose automatically pitches up to the flare position. Planes should only be in this configuration just before they touch the ground.
The autopilot raises the nose to break the descent. The autothrottles brings the power back to flight idle, and you touch down with the power either all the way in idle or just about to be in idle.
But Flight 1951 went into a slow, nose-up position well before touchdown, causing the plane to fly slower and slower throughout its descent. So why was Flight 1951 in landing mode? And why hadn't any of the 3 crew members noticed how slowly they were flying?
So, what else was going on when the engines went to idle?
The trouble seems to start with the malfunctioning altimeter.
We had to look at the system as a whole and to see how that -8 affected the other systems on the aircraft. And that was a very big portion of this investigation. We had to say, how did the autopilot use that data? More importantly, how did the auto throttle use that data?
The computer that flies the plane consists of 2 main systems, the autopilot and the auto throttle. The auto throttle determines how much power to ask the engines for, while the autopilot controls the plane's altitude and direction. The 2 systems work independently of each other, and only one of the radio altimeters provides information to the autothrottle.
In this case, I had to learn everything there was about radio altimeters and auto-throttle systems, which I didn't know before.
The pieces of the puzzle begin coming together when they find the connection between the faulty radio altimeter and engine power.
The radio altimeter provides information to the auto-throttle from the captain's side.
The only altimeter feeding information to the auto-throttle was the captain's, and it was wrong. It showed -8 feet throughout most of Flight 1951's approach. It's beginning to look like the faulty radio altimeter triggered the events that led to the crash. Investigators need to know what went wrong with it. On a 737, the transmitting and receiving antennas for both radio altimeters are lined up underneath the cockpit. 3 of the antennas were all but destroyed in the crash. They can't be tested. But one antenna from the captain's side is undamaged. Investigators consider 2 possibilities: a failure of one of the components, or some sort of interference that caused the faulty reading. The only component that survived the crash checks out. The computers that control the system also work. But investigators do make a curious discovery about them. They aren't the same ones that were installed on the plane when it was delivered to Turkish Airlines 7 years ago. This find changes the focus of the investigation.
The maintenance aspect of this accident aircraft was one that we looked at as deeply as we could.
When the plane's maintenance log is studied, investigators find that the radio altimeter on this plane had a problematic history.
We got additional data from Turkish Airlines, and that data showed that on this one aircraft, of the past, I believe, over 1,000 flights, there was about 150 flights that had faulty radio altimeter systems.
The documents show that a little more than a year before the crash, both computers were replaced because of complaints they were causing faulty readings. One of the incidents involved a radio altimeter reading of -8 feet.
So that was telling us that there was an issue that had been there. The issue did not just occur on this flight.
The faulty readings persisted. Mechanics repeatedly swapped the computers and replaced the antennas to try to solve the problem. It's determined that Turkish Airlines tried several ways to fix the altimeter, but they couldn't find a repair that worked. At the time of the accident, Turkish Airlines had a fleet of 52 Boeing 737-800 series airplanes.
It's on page 93.
When we reviewed the maintenance data, we found that radio altimeter problems had been written up several times on both the accident airplane and the fleet.
Investigators discover that in the year before the crash, Turkish Airlines dealt with 235 system faults with the radio altimeters on their 737s. Fixes ranged from replacing and exchanging antennas, cleaning of the systems, exchanging and replacing the computers, and installing gaskets to shield the system from possible water damage.
It's not like they weren't doing anything about it.
The Turkish Airlines maintenance personnel knew that the radio altimeter problem was one of their highest issues with regard to maintenance.
16 of those altimeter repairs were made to the plane that crashed in February 2009. If the problem was so widespread, investigators wonder why it hadn't caused serious problems before this accident. They don't have to dig too far back to find out that in fact it had, on this very same plane.
On 2 recent flights, they had the exact same problem.
Twice in the 48 hours leading up to the accident, the radio altimeter showed a negative reading, putting the plane into retard flare mode. Both times the crew noticed the problem. disengaged the auto throttles, and brought the plane in for a safe landing.
You just disconnect it and fly the airplane.
In the months after the crash, other operators come forward with similar stories. In Australia, in the Netherlands, in Canada, in Austria, pilots report their 737s going into retard flare mode when the left radio altimeter showed a faulty reading. Each of those crews reacted the same way. They disengaged the auto throttle and pushed the power back up manually. They all landed safely.
Things are going to break on an airplane, and usually you're able to identify that and take that out of, make it so that it's not a threat for the landing.
In 2008, Boeing received a whopping 2,569 reports of faulty radio altimeters on their latest 737s. But very few of those cases involved the plane going into retard flare mode.
Hardly any reports at all.
Boeing also tried but couldn't find the cause of the failures. They concluded that the radio altimeter problem was not a threat to safety because the 737 gives off enough warnings so that crews can intervene and land safely. In fact, in every instance where the radio altimeter failed, crews were able to recover. Turkish Airlines Flight 1951 seems to be the one exception. Investigators still don't know why.
It really got us wondering of what happened. And that's when we started to look really closely at the actions of the flight crews while it was on that final approach in less than 1,000 feet.
Finally, as investigators again revisit the last minutes of Flight 1951, the circumstances of the tragedy become clear. They see a remarkable sequence of events that transpire to bring down this plane.
So, what was happening when the plane went into retard flare mode?
They discover that the plane went into landing mode and pulled back power at the worst possible moment, exactly as the crew was descending to meet the glide slope.
It masked what was actually happening.
As the crew configured their plane to drop down to meet the glide slope, they expected the plane to slow down as part of that maneuver. But the plane was actually slowing down because the computer was in landing mode. That's why none of the three pilots said anything about the throttles moving to idle.
It was insidious. Where it first captured in the retard mode, it didn't hurt them at all because they were actually high and they were a little bit fast. And the pilots actually wanted the power back anyway. In fact, the throttles may have already been in the flight idle mode as they were trying to get down and slow down.
Right, the trouble starts here at 8,300 feet, 13 miles out from the airport, minutes before the crash.
Amsterdam. Turkish 1951, descending 7,000, speed 250.
Turkish 1951, descend to 4,000. Speed okay for ILS 18, right.
Radio altimeter.
Would the crew have known that because of that radio altimeter they would have gone to a retard flare mode in the throttles? No.
It was a common problem at the airline, but the crew couldn't see the risk it posed this flight.
We have an airplane that was malfunctioning in a very minor way, but in a way that, if not caught, could and did metastasize into something much more virulent.
Turkish 1951, descend to 2,000.
2,000, 1951.
Turkish 1951, left heading 210, cleared approach 18, right.
Left 210, clear ILS, Turkish 1951.
Now left at 210 degrees, maintaining 2,000 feet, brings the flight in right here, 5.5 miles out. They now have to intercept the glide slope from above.
At 2,000 feet, with the glide slope below them, the pilots have to reduce their speed while descending steeply.
Speed 140.
They believe the throttles are moving back for the descent to the glide slope. In fact, the auto throttle is slowing the plane down because it's gone into landing mode. It will continue to slow the plane until it stalls.
What we found is that when the flight crew was doing their before landing checklist, each one of them was doing something while they should have been monitoring their airspeed.
For the next 100 seconds, no one notices what's happening until it's too late.
Established altitude set.
1,000.
Check.
Flaps 40.
Speed set.
The experienced pilot recognized that the first officer was probably a little bit behind on the approach, so he calls for flaps 40 and moves the lever, informing the first officer that he has done so. He's trying to help the first officer catch up to the position of the aircraft.
Speed brake.
Speed brake armed. Green light.
One thing at a time. Landing gear.
The plane is now 700 feet from the ground.
Gear down. 3 green.
Flaps.
Flaps 40. Green light.
In their haste to complete their checklist, none of the 3 crew members noticed the warnings that their speed is dropping dangerously. First, a red bar appeared on their flight display. Then, when the airspeed continued to drop, a flashing box appeared around their actual airspeed to draw the pilot's attention to it. At this point, no one sees either.
Cabin report confirmed.
The aircraft is now 600 feet from landing.
When things start changing colors, it's a warning to you, it's a caution to you that you're approaching the limits of the aircraft.
Missed approach. Altitude set.
500.
So all of these indications the crew has in front of them saying that the aircraft is slowing down. During that time, they were still completing their checklist.
Of course, the aircraft is getting closer to the ground.
In fact, it's less than 500 feet from touchdown.
And right before the stick shaker started, the captain told the safety pilot,
"Please warn the cabin crew."
Cabin crew, take your seats. Speed, sir.
I have control.
By the time they advanced the throttles to full power, it was unrecoverable. They were too low for the engines to catch up.
And that's it. It's now too late to save this plane. They all knew about the altimeter problem, but knowing didn't help.
Boeing also didn't foresee the potentially deadly effect of a faulty altimeter. But on February the 25th, 2009, it triggered an unusual sequence of events that brought down a jetliner and killed 9 people. The official report into the accident blames it on a convergence of circumstances.
There is never, ever just one cause to an airline accident. It simply doesn't exist. Maybe someday God will swap one out of the sky, but until then, there's never one cause.
The Dutch report also points out that Boeing could have realized the problem with the radio altimeter system could have had an impact on safety. Given that no one foresaw how that failure might cause a crash, the Turkish Airlines accident raises a big question. Are airplanes becoming too complex? Investigators have determined that Turkish Airlines Flight 1951 crashed mainly because the pilots didn't recognize the consequences of the warnings they were getting.
Turkish 1951, descend to 4,000.
This is not the first plane to crash because the crew didn't understand what their plane was telling them.
Our problem is not the automation. Our problem is the depth of the training and the ability of the human beings to recover from mistakes made in interfacing with the automation.
Mika Ensley studies the relationship between pilots and technology.
We haven't really designed the automation to take best advantage of what people do well and take away the parts that people don't do well.
In 1996, the crew of an Aero Peru 757 crashed when the pilots couldn't decipher contradictory warnings about their altitude and airspeed. The plane flew into the Pacific Ocean. 61 passengers and 9 crew members were killed. In 1995, the flight management system on a Boeing 757 could and should have steered the plane to a safe landing in Cali, Colombia. But a last-minute change to the flight plan meant the crew had to reprogram their computer. They mistakenly entered a course that took them headlong into a 9,000-foot mountain. 159 people died in the crash.
The cautionary tale here is that we can get this equipment, we can get these silicon-based units, if you will, so sophisticated that we can't talk to them effectively. And when they go berserk, or they have a problem, or we misprogram them, we end up putting ourselves and our passengers in danger while we're trying to figure it out.
NASA is working on something called the Integrated Intelligent Flight Deck. It's a project aimed at helping humans better use the technology that surrounds them in the cockpit.
They're looking at automated flight manual systems, voice recognition systems. They've developed new kinds of microphones that are bone-conducting chips. They're developing new displays for understanding the ground environment, for being able to detect where other aircraft are in the environment.
What some researchers are finding is that the best technology shouldn't replace pilots, but work with them.
Really integrating people with technology more effectively has to do with designing the displays so that you can really understand what it's doing, and you can make it simpler to understand how to make it do what it is you want it to do. You shouldn't have to push 16 buttons through 8 levels of menus to figure out what's going on with the system. It should be integrated and presented effectively. It should be as easy to communicate with as the person next to you.
Boeing and Airbus, the two largest manufacturers of passenger planes, take very different approaches to the relationship between humans and technology. Airbus gives the flight computer much of the decision-making power in the cockpit.
In their view, this is a way to prevent a lot of human errors by making sure the airplane doesn't do something that's going to cause a crash, even if the humans wanted to.
But Boeing has a different view. Its philosophy is to provide information to pilots and have them make decisions.
Having more information is better for the pilot than having the pilot in the loop, in the equation, so to speak. I kind of like that.
Airbus will argue vociferously and in continuous fashion that view is archaic and incorrect. I think the jury is still out.
The final report into the Turkish Airlines tragedy blames the crash of Flight 1951 partly on a failure of technology.
The erroneous radio altimeter data caused the autothrottle to go to an improper mode that is, of course, not a good situation.
The cause of the radio altimeter failure was never uncovered. The Dutch investigation asks Boeing to improve the reliability of the system.
We learned a lot about the radio altimeter system and how it affects the autothrottle system. Boeing is currently working on system improvements to prevent this type of autothrottle event from occurring again.
But the report also faults the crew for not noticing that their airspeed was dropping dangerously low, in spite of the fact that there were 3 pilots on board.
Forget that you got an autothrottle. You look at the airspeed, and you look at the altitude. You look out the damn window if you want to, but airspeed is a crucial component of staying alive in an airplane. And you always need to know what your airspeed is.
But to Mika Ensley, the crew's failure to monitor instruments is entirely understandable and may be more the fault of the instruments than the crew.
It's actually very difficult for people to be monitors of automation. One of the things that people don't do a good job of actually is monitoring. We're very good on-the-spot decision makers. We're very good at coming up with creative solutions to problems, but repetitive monitoring is the kind of thing that actually people aren't very good at all. So what we have to do is design automation to work with people in a way that keeps them more actively, cognitively involved and in the loop, and not just monitoring a piece of automation to say, is it doing what it's supposed to be doing?
Who's the ultimate computer? The pilot, the individual who should be able to say, I don't know what this thing is doing to me, but I'm punching it off and flying the airplane. Fly the jet. Probably the smartest thing we ever learned to say in our training in the airlines, fly the jet. Do that first or nothing else counts. That's what they forgot to do.